In this lecture, we're going to focus on the elements of motor control, eventually working our way to understanding how the cerebellum contributes to motor control. But in this introduction, when we think about motor control, there are two very general aspects to voluntary movement. The first aspect are planned movements, and those planned movements are consciously mediated, consciously initiated according to the goals of that movement. And the second aspect relate to shaped movements, and those shaped movements relate to specific factors on how the movements are executed and are become particularly more important for movements that are more complex. And there are two general areas in the frontal lobe involved in the production and execution of movements. The first one is the primary motor cortex, identified as Brodmann's area 4. And the second main area we'll focus on is the premotor area located in Brodmann's area 6. There are also two subcortical areas, and in this unit, we'll focus on the cerebellum, that are involved in the fine-tuning of executed intentions to create movement. And so these subcortical areas are involved in shaping and refining that movement, and it does so by having extensions and projections to these motor areas. And so the motor areas are important because these are projections that go to neurons in the corticospinal tract. And these are the neurons that will extend in a descending manner along the spinal cord and will terminate onto the lower motor neurons or the alpha motor neurons. We begin with the primary motor cortex, and activity in this area, bioelectrical activity in this area, will undergo changes before the actual contraction of the relevant muscles, and that delay comes by way of the fact that the bioelectrical signals must be conveyed along long axons and create a synaptic connection activity with the lower motor neurons. And the primary motor cortex is an important area in the initiation and the triggering of movement. The corticospinal neurons are described in terms of their discharge frequency. So depending upon how quickly these neurons are activated and generate a wave of action potentials, that frequency does contribute and is a major factor in how much force a muscle is generated. Not focused on position primarily. So when we think about corticospinal neuron activation, think about these neurons having a direct effect in producing force, but if the conscious intention is to produce a position, we have to influence the force of the muscles in order to achieve those positions. And the corticospinal neurons does receive input from sensory information as well. So the sensory information coming from the periphery will provide information not just from the contact with the external world, but also relates to the speed and the position of the limbs, often described as proprioceptive. And to understand how the primary motor cortex is organized, the motor homunculus, or often described as the somatotopic map, which is what you see here on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, is a drawing here that attempts to explain how the somatotopic map, the region of the primary cortex, is dedicated to different parts of the body. And one particular muscle will have multiple locations on the map. So, for example, here we see in the dark red the primary motor cortex, or the cerebral cortex here. And if we take a look at the human thumb, we see that one of the muscles, although there are more than one muscle, but if we just focus on one of the muscles of the thumb, that muscle has an area dedicated along the cerebral cortex at multiple points on that map. Now, one cortical neuron, and that's illustrated here in the blue in this enlarged circle, will branch to multiple muscles. And so that's the numerous branching that takes place as it descends along the spinal cord to where it eventually synapses with the lower motor neurons directly or through interneurons at those locations of the spine. Related movements, for related movements, the neurons will overlap in the cerebral cortex. So if we take a look at the somatotopic map dedicated to the hand, we'll see that the neurons dedicated to this entire limb will overlap because when the limb when the hand makes a grip, the fingers will flex, the thumb will flex. Oftentimes, the wrist will flex as well. And so to carry that out, all of these neurons here do overlap. However, for unrelated movements, such as the movement of the hand and wrist, and perhaps the movement of the foot, those areas are represented in far different locations. And so as a result of that, we don't expect to see overlap of those neurons in those different regions. In terms of the premotor cortex, there are areas just rostral or anterior in this view, as we see on the picture on the bottom right-hand corner, to the primary motor area. And the premotor area is important in terms of planning goal-directed movements. There are two specific areas outside of the primary motor cortex involved in this capacity, and that's the supplementary area and the premotor area. And neurons from these two areas will project to the primary motor cortex, and we'll point this out here on this drawing here shortly. But these neurons in the supplementary and pre will project to the primary motor cortex and will also project to subcortical structures, mainly being the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, not pictured here on this drawing, as well as to the spinal cord. And so as we pivot over here to our drawing, here we see our primary motor cortex, or Brodmann's area 4, highlighted just rostral to the central sulcus. Hence, this area is often referred to as the precentral gyrus. The supplementary motor area is just rostral to the primary motor cortex, labeled area 6, and also labeled area 6 to provide a little bit more detail or a little bit more distinguished in terms of distinguishing this area from the supplementary is the premotor area, also defined as Brodmann's area 6. So as we go back to the primary motor cortex, oftentimes in the nervous system, an understanding of the different structures comes by way of the changes in response or the changes that characterize different conditions or diseases. And so when we have a lesion of regions in the primary motor cortex, that will lead to a weakness, an inability to activate muscles. In terms of the premotor area lesions, those will affect the inability for conducting or the inability for designing a movement strategy. So a premotor area weakness will oftentimes be characterized by inaccurate and inefficient movements. The muscles will be able to be activated, but the actual movements from the inefficient activation of those muscles will be revealed by the actual movements. And just as a review here, as opposed to lesions in the primary motor cortex, in which these neurons project directly to lower motor neurons, those lower motor neurons would not be able to be activated, and as a result, muscles would not be activated, resulting in muscle weakness. One such condition that is involved in the production, or rather the inability to produce complex movements, is apraxia. And apraxias can operate through lesions, or will manifest as lesions in the supplementary or in the posterior parietal association area. Now, when you see the term posterior parietal, that's pointing to a sensory function of that helps to guide movements. And so apraxia is defined essentially as the inability to perform complex acts or learned or purposeful movements. And one such example is speech apraxia. So in terms of speech apraxia, the manifestation of that is the inefficient and inaccurate activation of muscles that will produce speech. So that will result in distorted sounds if there are lesions in that supplementary or the posterior parietal sensory areas. So longer words, the need to contract muscles for a slightly longer period of time would be harder to pronounce. The errors in speech would not be consistent as a reflection of the fact that there are so many words to be pronounced, and it's not just one word or one element of speech that is affected because of the inaccurate production of those muscle contractions. Another sign of speech apraxia is what's described as groping for sounds, or a person that is attempting to make certain sounds as those sounds eventually come out in a distorted manner. In terms of the supplementary motor area, the supplementary motor areas are involved in the programming of the complex sequences of movement through a very coordinated sequential activation of muscles. And some examples of the importance of the supplementary motor area involve bilateral movements, movements that involve proximal muscles. For these types of movements, there are direct projections to the spinal cord. And so when I say to the spinal cord, I'm referring to the alpha motor neurons, because it's those motor neurons that directly synapse onto the skeletal muscle fibers. In terms of movements that involve distal muscles, the involvement of the supplementary motor area is one that would be indirect, and that would operate through the motor cortex. And so if we take a look at our drawing here, on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, we see our supplementary motor area defined by this border that I just drew here. And in terms of activation of the distal muscles, and those are the muscles involved with hand and distal limb movement. When you think about activation of the hand, that certainly involves a much more complex and coordinated sequence of muscle actions. These neurons would project a very short distance to the primary motor area to help coordinate the activation of these corticospinal neurons. But in terms of proximal muscle activation, the supplementary motor area also sends projections directly downstream or descending along the spinal cord. In terms of the premotor area, which also sits rostral to the primary motor cortex, the premotor area receives input from the posterior parietal cortex, remembering that this region, which is located caudal, or in this image here, posterior to the central sulcus, is sensory in nature. So this is the area that does receive input from the somatosensory system, which is involved in the sensation of touch with respect to the external world, but also conveys information related to muscle contraction and limb position, as well as the visual areas are processed in the posterior parietal cortex. And by receiving input from the posterior parietal cortex, the premotor area through the sensory information does provide an important element to movement control. In terms of premotor area projections, these neurons will project directly to the primary motor cortex in a similar way that we saw on the previous slides as it related to the supplementary motor area. And these will also project to the brainstem and are involved in the medial descending system. That medial descending system is the reticulospinal pathway, and that's the pathway that is involved in the activation of more, not just in the more medial and proximally located muscles, but these are muscles that are important in the maintenance of upright posture. And so if we go over to our diagram here we have Brodmann's areas 5 and 6 highlighted here in the posterior parietal cortex, and the premotor area also sitting rostral to primary motor cortex area 4 houses these neurons which receive projections from neurons from the posterior parietal cortex. And so based upon the sensory information, the smooth coordination of movements is going to be guided by the current state of the body, and that will project the neuron in the premotor cortex will project to the primary motor area to assist with the optimal activation of those corticospinal neurons, but will also directly project through the medial descending system of the reticulospinal pathway. So this ends our first part to our study on the cerebellum.